So thank you. Thank you, Mariana. I enjoyed your talk. So yes, our talk has changed, and my co-author changed as well. And I'll give you a little, what we're going to look at today is demographic processes and demographic feedbacks, in particular the demographic transition and its impact on migration momentum. And one of the reasons that this changed, we changed our approach, is you know, I'm working with some data that I've worked with a long time, but realizing that in fact, perhaps I hadn't really taken into account some really fundamental underlying processes that are at work, and that before we jumped ahead into some fancy modeling like growth models, which we were trying to estimate, or network modeling, that we better understand better these really fundamental population changes. And this also comes from having done a lot of fieldwork, qualitative fieldwork, and watching families change both in size and kinship relationships over 25 years, and realizing that these very fundamental demographic changes were reorganizing lives in ways that were really important for understanding migration. So I wanted to get back to the fundamentals of demography, and that's what I'm going to do today. And I want to acknowledge my co-author, Michelle, who's with me and has been a equal author on this paper. So we've had a lot of good support on this project. And let me quickly say, you know, demographic transition, we sort of wave our hands at it often. We almost take it for granted nowadays, but it has policy. It's fundamentally both, it derives from some policy, and especially in the context in which I'm talking, Thailand, very fundamental family planning policies that were put in place in the 1970s that shrank families dramatically. And that coincided with it's hard to tell actually what the causal mechanism is here with regards to economic development and migration. And this raises a number of methodological challenges, and the site that I'm going to focus on is a relatively small place in Thailand, but a place where we've been able to do some research for over a 16-year period. And that 16 years of data have proven to be quite useful and helpful. And at the time that they were collected, relatively innovative, especially with regards to the prospective study design and the full population counting that we did in terms of following migrants, keeping track of villages and communities, the entire village and all the communities over the 16-year period. So I just sort of ran through our overview of our talk, and we have a modeling approach and some initial results, and I have a few conclusions. Okay, so why should we care about this demographic transition? Well, for one thing, a lot of, and not just demographers, would say that it's probably one of the most important changes in around the globe that is still underway in some places, but seems to be a somewhat inevitable secular shift in fertility and mortality from high, fluctuating, a lot of fluctuation in fertility and mortality to low and relatively stable. The implications of that shift are that we have very big changes in age structure. So we have bottom-heavy kinds of population age structures to now much more top-heavy or rectangular age structures. This implies some important relational changes that are happening. That is, your horizontal kin network is going to shrink. Probably the overall size of your kin network is going to shrink, but you're going to have old great-great-great-grandparents, and there's going to be a deepening of that kin network, which also has implications for thinking about resource flows and income and family relations. And I'm actually was thinking about Mariana. I was thinking about my paper when I was listening to Mariana. But thinking about these transnational families and what that implies as well in relation to this. Third change that is really quite profound and relates to my other work, which just has to do with gender and migration, is that as a result of the demographic transition, you have women spending a lot less time bearing and caring for children and more time doing other things. And in fact, other work that I've done on migration, there's a certain blind spot that a lot of migration scholars have about gender and in the literature. And the blind spot is one, well, how do women and men differ? How are they the same? What are they doing in migrant corridors and streams? And then there's sort of a little bit of a bias towards, well, women are migrating for family and caring reasons and domestic work. And we're not thinking about the fact that actually women have been migrating for a lot longer than was actually observed and talked about in the literature. And they're doing a lot more than just care work. So there needs to be a fairly substantial corrective still in this literature. And the demographic transition is, a fundamental piece of this because they're not having to spend as much time doing bearing and rearing children. Finally, demographic transition implies longer life, and it compels one to invest in human capital because it'll pay off. You'll have higher likelihood of returns. And we're going to have expanding number of years at older ages in which to benefit from those investments. So these are really, even though we could say, I'm not trying to make a sort of a functionalist or deterministic idea here. I'm merely saying that these population structural changes are going to imply big social changes, and different places are going to reorganize social life in different ways to take care of and continue this individual and community development. So in the case of Thailand, and I guess what I should say finally, this is really about internal migration, so it's about rural-urban migration. But Thailand itself is very much embedded in a global economy. Most of the rural-urban migration is to export manufacturing or agro-industrial export work, or it's related to the incredibly rapid urbanization in Bangkok and the surrounding areas and people's involvement in construction industries. So the rural peasant economy is linked into the global economy, but most of this movement is to urban destinations. Just to give you a little sense of how dramatic the change has been over the period of time in which we have these data, you can see in 1980, at the beginning of our period, you have the classic pyramid structure of population age structure. In 1990, you start to see the shrink, the bulge moving up, and then in 2000, you're seeing it go up even further. When I was there in August, the newspapers, the academics, everybody is completely freaked out about what they're going to do with all these old people in Thailand, how they're going to take care of them. It's an incredibly difficult policy and social challenge. In addition, and as you can see, between 1970 and 2000, the life expectancy has grown by 14 years. So really fast growth in life expectancy over a period of time. So why do we care? How do we think about how the coincidence of demographic transition is related to migration? Well, what we know, and there's a recent very good special issue of Population Development Review edited by Ron Lee, and what we know is that the youth bulge yields what people are calling as a demographic dividend. And that dividend is understood to be that young adults in this bulge have a very light demographic burden. They don't have as many younger siblings and people to take care of. And they have a lot of siblings who can help out with elder care as well. And so they're free to be themselves, free to expand and grow and have realizations of their individuality perhaps, or to move. And when do they move? Well, there hasn't been a lot of research theorizing or estimating the impact of this demographic dividend on migration, but one argument is that in the context, you could go in either direction with regards to how the demographic dividend would play out. In some contexts of full employment and institutional structures, you could have this demographic dividend staying put and leading to sort of endogenous growth and savings and investments in the place of origin. On the other hand, in contexts of high unemployment and low wages, you would have a out-migration from those places. And I would argue, and several people over the last 2 days have suggested so, that these kinds of contexts abound in places that have had high population growth and have this demographic dividend, and you get this large out-migration. So how does this relate to feedback? How do we think about this in terms of feedbacks? Well, one thing that we might want to be aware of is that as a place moves through the demographic transition, and as cohorts shrink, you might have a changing, you have people migrating out, and so the people that are left behind have to reorganize their social world to take care of family. Another is that this value of human capital investment and status, you might develop some sets of disequilibrium that in turn lead to some kinds of feedbacks, either negative or positive, with regards to migration. So I'm actually being quite, I'm not making any hypothetical claims, I'm just suggesting some possibilities. Well, one of the things that's very important is people who study the life course and demographic transitions is the distinction between your age and your cohort and the year effects. And we call this age period and cohort effects. And these are really quite distinct. So age effects are those variations that are associated with physiological life experiences and status changes that one has accumulated up to a point of time of a particular age. Another are your period effects. Those are variations across groups of people who have experienced formative events in the same year. And then there are cohort effects, and these are sort of a combination of both age and period, but there are variations across groups of people who have experienced formative events in the same year. So, we have in the US, we often talk about the baby boom cohort as being somewhat distinct from the Generation Y, Generation X sets of cohorts. And we think of these as groups of people who have had formative life experiences at times that really are quite distinct from other people who were who go through life transitions at different times. But disentangling age, period, and cohort effects is a methodological challenge, and that's one of our next steps. Actually, is to run models that take into account those factors as well as others. And a key element here is finding sites with enough variation across age, period, and cohort and other factors related to migration. One of the things that I think is a challenge for this topic is that economic development, change, migration, and the demographic transition all almost coincide with each other. So figuring out the causal relationship, whether there are any causal relationships between them, or figuring out what are the relationships, how they associate, is going to be other than just that they are almost, highly correlated. So Thailand, I just show you a quick picture of economic growth and unemployment, or employment trends. Typically, migration, rural-urban migration in the Thai context is to construction, export manufacturing, whether textiles or heavy industry. There was a fair amount of volatility in the economic growth over the first part of the period, the 1980s, although the economy grew by about 10% per year during between 1984 to 1995 and until the 97 crash. The crash was fairly short-lived, and since then the economy's been growing at about 4%, 5% rate. So here we have this tiny little place in northeastern Thailand that I've been studying for a long time. It's a very poor place, but it had a very rapid contraceptive uptake during the early 70s onward. Initially, it was a frontier destination, so as part of a national security strategy by the Thai government to settle the hinterlands in the 1950s and 60s, and then in the 1970s, it became a hotbed of communism and a lot of economic development on the part of the Thai government to allay peasant revolutions. And then in the 1980s, there was a mid-70s, there was a fairly strong effort to control population as part of another national security strategy. The data that we've collected has been between 1984 and 2000. It initially included 41 villages, 7,000 households. We focus with these data on the life histories that we've collected in 94 and 2000 that actually are, I think, 180,000 person-year records. This is what I'm presenting today is mostly quantitative, but I've spent a lot of time in the field there, living there in 1992 for a year, and then visiting every year on a regular basis just to see friends, and then doing field work on the dates that I show below. Okay, so what I wanted to show here quickly is that we have a fair amount of variability across villages. So in 1994, we followed 22 villages, followed migrants from 22 villages to the major migrant destinations. We have about a 70% follow-up rate. What you can see here is our migrant prevalence rates by village and year. So overall, there's an overall uptick in the patterns of migration, growth in migration rates, but fair amount of variability across villages. We have some villages that are already high villages throughout the period, some that grow quite quickly and steeply, and others that remain fairly low in terms of migrant prevalence. What we've done is we've categorized our our data into cohorts that reflect different parts of the demographic transition. So we have those cohorts in the yellow that are part of the beginning of the baby boom. We have the orange, which is the peak of the baby boom. 1971 is actually the highest number of births per women in Thailand. And then the fall-off cohorts in blue. I'm going to go quickly. We estimate, so we have these cohort measures. There are 8 of them. We estimate, we predict whether or not someone's going to move out in a time t. And we look at that any of our time-varying variables are all t-1 year. And then we estimate a Poisson regression, partly because we have everybody, the whole population of people, and we have a lot of zeros. Not everybody's moving. So we have to do this to avoid sort of overestimating, over-dispersion in our 0-1 distribution. And then we set a set of reduced form estimates of cohorts influence, and then we look at cohorts plus our typical model that I've used in the past, sort of a base model of individual household and village variables, as well as migration experience, plus an interaction with cohort and sex. So I'm really hoping that I can go a little bit longer. But so quickly, here we have pictures, descriptive patterns of accumulated trips per person by cohort. What I'd like to point out is basically on the top graph you see the darkest line, solid line, is the oldest cohort. They accumulate early a lot of trips in the period. When we adjust for the distribution across people, that's what the migrant prevalence rate shows. What we see is that the the peak boom cohorts are the ones that cross-cut and climb rapidly in terms of migrant prevalence. So that would be that the pyramid that cuts through the overall trend. I'm going to skip this. Okay. I'm trying to think about what to do here in terms of time. So we have, I'm going to show you the results for the, I'm going to show you the results for the boom peak cohorts and the peak decline cohorts. So what we've done is our reference category are the cohort the members of the cohort in the peak 1970-72 grouping. And what we can see in the final third column is that for every cohort that's older than this one, they're less likely to migrate out of the village. In addition, but if you're a male in these older cohorts, you're more likely to migrate, slightly more likely to migrate than women in the older cohorts. When we look at the peak and decline cohorts, we see a shift in the pattern. First of all, we don't see a real difference in overall, once we control for everything, we don't see much difference in the cohorts in the far right column, the third column. But we do see is that we have a lot more women migrating in these younger cohorts in the relative to the peak cohort. So the shrinking cohorts, you start to see more women being pulled into the migrant stream. Okay, so first of all, we wanted to quick conclusions. It appears to us that for the most part, cohort membership is significant net of other explanations. I didn't show you the results, but oldest cohorts, our pioneers, are actually a very select group of people. Whereas for the peak and the largest cohorts, it's a much less selective group of people. So it's becoming much more widespread in these middle cohorts. And then by the end of the period, in the youngest cohort, we have an increasingly feminized migration. What we'd like to do next is we want to take a look at how the demographic deficit, or the shrinking cohorts, reshape migration and life in origin communities. And then we'd like to also ask, how does the act of migration change in its meaningfulness within each cohort? So we suspect that migration becomes a very different form and very different act with each. It has different significance and meaning. Its timing is different. The way it happens is different. And the nature of connectedness between migrants across cohorts changes over time. That's it. Did I do it?